everybody. My name is Jaime Figueroa. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to talk to you a little bit about a brief history of U.S. Cuba relationships. Let's face it, when most Americans think about Cuba, the first thing that comes to mind is either Cold War or communism. For most Cubans, on the other hand, they think more of a neo-colonial period heavily influenced by the Monroe Doctrine. That said, for the past 5 to 6 years, both nations have made attempts to normalize their diplomatic relations. This event seeks to put an end to decades of hostilities and begin a new era. But to fully understand how big of a deal this is, where these hostilities really come from, and why it has taken so long for both countries to come together, we must go back on time. Not to the 1950s, but to the 1850s. The story basically starts with the U.S. divided between pro-slavers and anti-slavery politics. One of the many reasons such division was about how to proceed regarding Cuba. In one hand, pro-slavery politicians in the South wanted to buy Cuba from Spain or take it by force, turning it into a new slave state. Meanwhile, anti-slavery politicians in the North opposed this and saw it as an imperialistic move. By 1898, the U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba had a different version of the same argument when Cubans rose against Spain. After the tragic explosion of the USS Maine in Havana, the U.S. joins the rebel side, starting what is now known as the Spanish-American War. However, Americans remain divided. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain or grant the island an opportunity to self-rule? Although this was an argument about Cuba, it is important to know it was also an argument about what kind of country the U.S. aspired to be. Should the U.S. be the kind of country that controls Cuba or that respected as a sovereign nation? Such argument continues to be debated today. At this point, the fight moves to Congress, and both sides put forward legislation trying to get their way. The end result? A semi-compromise that grants Cuba a halfway independence. The Platt Amendment of 1901 gives the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever they saw fit. Furthermore, it allows the U.S. to seize Guantanamo Bay in perpetuity and dictates Cuban foreign policy. Then came the American interventions in Cuba between 1906 and 1917. In both occasions, the U.S. takes total control of the country for a few years under the pretense of resolving political crisis. But what that usually really meant was protecting U.S. corporate interests such as sugar and tobacco imports at the time. This imperial era fortunately came to an end in 1933, when once again, Cubans rose against their puppet-like government. America was supposed to intervene once again, but President Roosevelt at the time wanted to put an end to the interventionist practice, so he declared neutrality. Over the next 20 years, Cuba flourished as a democracy friendly to its neighbor, the U.S. That said, Gerardo Machado, Cuba's president at the time, refused to bow down to U.S. corporate interests. The Library of Congress website quoted him saying, "It is a prerogative of the president of Cuba to determine which foreign policy best serve our nation, not a private enterprise." Unfortunately, by 1952, Fulgencio Batista, a former president and military leader, stages a coup with the U.S. backing. The Constitution is then suspended, and an increasing suppressive role is imposed upon the people. As an unintended result, this brutal regime gave life to a communist uprising led by who we know now as Fidel Castro. At the time, U.S. was submerged in a wave of fear about communism that led them to support the existing regime regardless of their brutality. For many Americans, this represented a direct fight against communism, but for Cubans, it felt like Batista was just an extension of the American imperialism that they have known for many years before. By 1959, Castro guerrilla forces overthrow Batista and they takes power and absolute control of the island. The U.S. is still submerged in fear of communism and isolates Cuba further into an embargo, hoping to cripple their economy, attempts to assassinate Castro, and orchestrate the CIA fiasco now known as Bay of Pigs. By the U.S. Department of State of Archive best describes the level of mistrust and paranoia coming from within the U.S. political system by highlighting President Eisenhower's 1960 statement. He daringly said, and I quote, "The U.S. would not permit the establishment of a regime dominated by international communism in the Western Hemisphere." Under such existential threat, Fidel Castro's regime is then forced to turn to the Soviet Union for help. By 1962, things have escalated so rapidly that we nearly started World War III. The incident scared everyone enough that things settled in a somewhat peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans found themselves squeezed between an economic embargo and the Castro dictatorship. In 1980, Castro allowed political dissidents to leave the island. A whooping total of 125,000 arrived in Miami, Florida. Now, at the time, no one could have ever imagined, but this event added a new dimension to the conflict. It gave way to an internal battle in the U.S. between Castro and Cuban dissidents, which played an active role in American politics. After the collapse of the USSR, President Bill Clinton sought to end the conflict, but Cuban Americans in the U.S. applied enough political pressure to deter the Clinton administration from removing the embargo against the Caribbean nation. Therefore, the embargo remained. In 2014, 20 years later, President Obama attempts to once again end the conflict. Things were different now. The embargo support is not what it once was. Many Cuban Americans migrating from the islands do not do so for economic reasons rather than political ones. With the assistance of the Vatican and Pope Francis, both nations started secret talks in 2013. In 2014, the agreement came to an end to end the conflict. It's revealed then in 2015, and President Obama became the first president to visit Cuba since 1928. Today, things have taken a turn towards the failed techniques of the past. We have elected an administration who prefers to double down on the failed draconian policies of the past rather than find a new way into success. The U.S. and Cuba have never enjoyed a normal relationship. This brief history helps us understand why it has taken so long for it to happen. As we have learned, a lot has taken place between the two nations over the last 2 centuries. The U.S. has at times treated its neighbor more like a colony rather than an independent nation. It is indeed a lot to get over it, but it looks like both countries today are closer than ever to reconcile. Hold it. Here's my audience. Yay!